John Winston Jones was, in many ways, a perfect example of a mid-19th century community leader. Like many lawyers of the time, not unlike today, he wore many hats. He graduated from the College of William and Mary and then rose to prominence in Virginia, practicing law, becoming a local prosecutor, and serving in the state's constitutional convention. He would run for Congress as an Andrew Jackson Democrat, securing that position in the mid-1830s. He would typically garner around 70% of the vote for his reelection bids, running unopposed twice. He was Speaker of the House in the mid-40s. Like many from his native Virginia, he probably feared the future. He was also petrified of change. In rising on the floor of the House to speak against legislation that would have abolished slavery in the nation's capital, he decried what he would call the great revolutionizers of the world. But what did he mean? Marx had not yet written Das Kapital. The Paris Commune had not yet emerged. Jones' revolutionizers were actually quite commonplace, and they were sewn into the fabric of everyday life. The great revolutionizers Jones feared were none other than the US postal system and steam power. The steam that was reshaping life in so many ways and made possible the creation of a new printing press, one able to increase the ability of printers to generate tracts and pamphlets at a rate that exceeded more traditional presses by 600% and at a fraction of the cost. Jones feared these great revolutionizers because a new social movement had emerged at the time as these revolutionizers were converging, threatened to challenge the Southern way of life, that is, slavery. This new social uprising, the Abolitionist Movement, was harnessing the power of this new steam printing press to generate anti-slavery literature and the postal system, even in the South, to disseminate it. For Jones, the abolitionists used these tools to, quote, circulate throughout the slaveholding states large numbers of newspapers, pamphlets, tracts, and pictures calculated in an imminent degree to rouse and inflame the passions of the slaves against their masters, to urge them on to deeds of death, and to involve them all in the horrors of a servile war, production which were as foul libels upon the people of the South as were ever printed. For Jones, these twin forces both symbolized change and threatened to bring it about. While the power of steam had permeated life in the 19th century in many ways, from steamboats to trains, the postal system was also a fixture in American life at the time. Moreover, our postal system rivaled those of the great powers. It had twice as many outposts as that of Great Britain, and 5 times as many as France. On the eve of the American Revolution, there were 4 post offices for every 100,000 inhabitants of the colonies. By Jones's time, that figure had risen nearly 2,000% to 74 for every 100,000 inhabitants, or 1 post office for every 1,300 Americans. The postal system of the 19th century reached into every nook and cranny of the new republic, and the postal workforce was larger than the US military at the time. For many, as the historian Richard John has argued, the postal system was the federal government. That this new social movement, the abolitionist movement, was deft at harnessing these communications tools, the postal system and the steam printing press that had converged at the time as the movement arose, is a pattern that we see repeating itself throughout American history. And it starts from even US prehistory, if you would. Before 1750, there were just a few printing presses in the colonies. By the late 1760s, there were dozens spread throughout the eastern seaboard. After incurring significant debt from waging the French and Indian War, the British Parliament faced the prospect of raising income from its subjects, especially those it saw as being the prime beneficiaries of the victory in that war, the American colonists. But it made a crucial mistake in its calculations over how to pay for the debt. It taxed the very profession, printers, that could muster opposition to the law. Imagine if today we decided to pay for the cost of coronavirus relief with a tremendous tax on all forms of modern communication, from network television, premium cable, Netflix, cell phone providers, Apple, and all of social media combined. Think of the opposition that would assemble from both within these industries and from every American benefiting from these services. Not surprisingly, the assemblage of printers became radicalized and turned into a voice for independence. Printers became leaders among the young rebellion. In lore and through clever marketing, we think of Samuel Adams as a brewer and patriot. He was also a Boston newspaper publisher. What is more, the postal system in the 1770s became a critical means of communication for the revolutionaries. Meeting in the Continental Congress in 1775, the members of that group knew it was important that their communications remain secret. They feared the Crown's postal system at the time because loyalist postal clerks could pry into their communications. In one of the Continental Congress's first official acts, a year before voting for independence, it would vote to create what it called a constitutional post, stretching from what is now Maine to Georgia, with Ben Franklin as the first postmaster general. The centrality of the post and the printing press to the work of the Continental Congress has been lost somewhat to time. We often think of the date of July 4th as when the Declaration of Independence was first read to the public, but that is not the case. What we celebrate on the 4th of July is when the group agreed to final changes to the document, and it was transmitted to the printer, John Dunlap of Philadelphia. In other words, what we celebrate on the 4th of July is when the Continental Congress pressed send. Fast forward to the 20th century. One Sunday night, 55 years ago last month, in living rooms across the country, tens of millions of Americans gathered together to watch Judgment at Nuremberg, a dramatic depiction of the post-World War II trials of German judges during the Holocaust, where Albany Law's own Robert Jackson gave the closing arguments. One of the key themes of the film was the culpability of regular Germans for Nazi atrocities. With a star-studded cast, which included Spencer Tracy, Burt Lancaster, Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, and even a real up-and-comer, William Shatner, the show promised ratings gold. Once underway, however, the broadcast was interrupted by breaking news alerts, coverage from earlier in the day when civil rights activists had violated an order to refrain from marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. They were beaten mercilessly, and those acts were captured on newsreels and shown to Americans sitting in front of their televisions. The juxtaposition of the images from Bloody Sunday was striking against the backdrop of Judgment at Nuremberg. With its key theme of moral culpability, it helped galvanize public support for what would become the Voting Rights Act. The civil rights movement was well aware of the power of the television to expose the brutal acts of terror unleashed from public authorities and private groups on protesters, from those sitting in at lunch counters to the participants in the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, where televised images of police dogs and water cannons let loose on teenage protesters shocked the American electorate and helped to win passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The movement and television, in many ways, grew up together. And as television executives wanted to establish the seriousness of the medium, it wanted to cover serious topics. One example of this phenomenon was the NBC documentary that showed young activists at lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee, including a young John Lewis, who was, of course, also at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Once aired, the film was then used by movement leaders for recruitment and training purposes for future activists, showing them the ins and outs and risks associated with nonviolent protests. These three examples and many more in the book show what I believe is a key theme that emerges, that there is often a symbiotic relationship between social movements and communications technologies. Indeed, since the dawning of the American experiments, social movements have long captivated our attention as they leveraged advances in communications technology to make social change. The Sons of Liberty utilized the printing press, the abolitionists, the steam printing press and the postal system, the women's movement of the mid-19th century, the telegraph, progressive groups, the telephone and the transcontinental railroad. The radio helped launch the New Deal, and the television was critical to the civil rights movement. Some of the great social movements in American history have often brought about social change when Americans have leveraged advances in communications technology to promote new ways of ordering society. And each advance in communications technology is often accompanied by the rise of a new and great social movement. but the technology itself has not brought about that change. Successful social movements that have emerged contemporaneously with advances in the ability to communicate have changed society, no doubt. And in the book, I call the instances when they have done so social innovation moments. In these moments in particular, whether it was the abolitionists or the activists in the civil rights movement, in addition to utilizing advances in communications technology and harnessing them to create social change, successful social movements have done two other things exceptionally well. First, they have operated through grassroots networks built on face-to-face encounters. Like the postal system itself, these networks were created at the local level, and the nodes of the networks were connected to larger nation-spanning structures. In fact, these networks often looked like the postal system in more ways than one, and often emerged simultaneously with that system itself. As a new post office was created, groups would communicate by mail with residents in the town where the office was located, encouraging them to create a new branch of the organization there. In many ways, then, the great groups of the 19th and most of the 20th century often mimicked the postal system in organization and reach. These translocal networks, which connected small individual nodes where people could meet face-to-face, communicate with each other, build trust, and foster social capital that could be activated to make change, are essential features of the great social movements that emerged in these social innovation movements. Second, and this is the third thing these movements have done well, they typically embraced positive, unifying messages that stressed shared humanity and shared interests over difference, looking for what Derek Bell would call interest convergence. Bell would use this interest convergence lens to help us see how the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was able to secure a unanimous victory at the Supreme Court in the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education. There, Bell would argue that the interests of civil rights advocates would converge with white elites who saw it necessary for the United States to end the Jim Crow system in the South because of the harm it caused to America's reputation abroad as we were locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The images I talked about earlier, where violence against civil rights activists, primarily people of color, were not just used by the civil rights movement, they were also fodder for Soviet propaganda in the developing world. Presidents from Truman through Johnson were aware of the difficulty the Jim Crow system and the media's portrayal of racial violence posed for American foreign policy, and knew progress on civil rights was essential to winning the Cold War. In fact, in a telephone conversation I document in the book between President Lyndon Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Johnson notes that the Civil Rights Act was not just his administration's greatest domestic policy achievement, it was also his greatest foreign policy achievement. During these social innovation moments throughout American history then, what successful social movements have done well in such moments are three things. They have first leveraged the most modern form of communication technology available to them. Second, create and sustain translocal grassroots networks. And third, they have used such technologies and networks to promote an inclusive, unifying message to combat inequality in different forms. A perfect example of this three-pronged strategy, what I call in the book the social change matrix, is the effort on the part of the American Legion during the Second World War to advance what came to be known as the GI Bill. There, the Legion harnessed the power of modern communications technologies, from telegrams it would send to local chapters and leaders to the movie houses where it would play short film clips promoting the effort to support congressional passage of the bill. These technologies helped the Legion activate its 12,000 chapter membership. To repeat, 12,000 chapters, not 12,000 members, scattered throughout the United States to confer and advocate with local elected officials and secure editorial support from local newspapers. Importantly, representing the third part of the social change matrix, the organization also promoted a personalized, humanized, and inclusive message by generating a report that highlighted 1,500 individual cases of veterans returning from the war shattered and with few social or economic supports. The Legion also fought for a broad-based inclusive benefits package designed to combat economic inequality that returning veterans would face. Indeed, returning veterans who served in the military, regardless of whether they saw combat or the duration of their service, could tap into the GI Bill's broad and generous benefits and transform their lives and change the United States forever, creating a period sometimes referred to as the Great Compression, where economic inequality in the United States was at one of its lowest points in our history. One of the reasons this would occur was that the GI Bill's educational benefits would launch America as the economic superpower over the next 2 decades by helping Americans build human capital. Indeed, in 1947, roughly half of all students attending college at the time were GI Bill beneficiaries. Shockingly, given the incredible impact of GI Bill benefits, the scale of the education program that through those benefits paled in comparison to the cost of the recent bailout package passed by Congress. In constant dollars, the GI Bill's education benefits cost the federal government $128 billion, or half of just the first phase of the Paycheck Protection Program. But the GI Bill also did something else, which is often another product of social movements, particularly in social innovation moments. The work of the American Legion in securing benefits for returning veterans also exposed a significant problem in the United States. Returning veterans could obtain educational benefits and housing benefits like home loan guarantees, but African-American veterans found those benefits were worth less to them. Institutions of higher education denied them admission. Lenders wouldn't lend to them. The experience of helping to win the Second World War, coupled with the discrimination returning African-American veterans faced, galvanized many veterans, turning them into activists, including leaders like Medgar Evers, who drew a straight line from his status as a veteran to a foot soldier and then leader in the civil rights movement. This kind of connection between social innovation moments is apparent in other epochs as well. Famously, 2 of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, met in London at a national anti-slavery convention in 1840. Although Mott was recognized as an abolitionist leader, she was denied the right to speak at the convention. Shaken by this experience, Stanton and Mott agreed during that convention that they needed to build a movement, like the Abolitionist Movement, for women's rights in the United States. Several years later, and just a few months after the creation of the Telegraph spurred the formation of the Associated Press, the Seneca Falls Convention was held, hastily organized in just a couple of weeks. Although other similar conventions had been held in previous years, what was different with this convention was that newspapers had a way to communicate in real time across the country. As word of the convention spread, copycat gatherings took place throughout the country, and the women's movement was born. Social innovation moments are often linked in these ways, in a daisy chain, drawing leadership from prior movements, learning lessons, copying tactics. For example, just as the women's movement grew out of the abolitionist movement, they also took lessons from the street-level organizing that the abolitionists engaged in. In the late 19th century, women's movement leaders had local organizers go town to town to build local cells of their broad translocal network, just as the abolitionists had done in the first half of that century. Let's look at the civil rights movement again and the groups that followed it in a key inflection point for the connection between social movements and technology. After the decision in Brown v. Board of Education and the passage of such laws as the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, other groups looked at these victories and said, we'll have what they're having. Groups like the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund and Lambda Legal were formed to fight, respectively, for the rights of Puerto Rican Americans and the LGBTQ community. Similarly, others created the Now Legal Defense and Education Fund and the Sierra Club Legal Defense and Education Fund. But while these organizations saw the successes of the civil rights movement and wanted to expand those victories, something else was also happening. Indeed, around the same time that these organizations were forming, a new communications technology appeared on the scene. And like many social movements before them, these groups embraced that technology and tried to leverage it to advance social change. As we've seen in earlier periods, like with the postal system, these groups also took on the shape of that new technology. That new shape, though, allowed these new groups to mostly bypass translocal organizing, that had played such a critical role in social movements to that point in American history. Indeed, that new technology, the computerized mailing list, enabled these new groups to create organizations without actually engaging in organizing. What is more, they assumed a shape not unlike the computerized mailing list itself, a centralized, controlling organization with tendrils that reached directly out to each member, if we could call them that, with no need for local chapters. Members, to the extent these groups have them, exist only on paper, and such organizations can be referred to as bodiless heads. Instead of taking the range of lessons available from the civil rights movement and the successful social movements that came before, and choosing to create true translocal organizations that attracted new and diverse members by stressing interest convergences, these groups, for the most part, formed into silos and did not engage in the formation of translocal networks. Case in point today, on the streaming service Hulu, you can watch a dramatic retelling of a grassroots effort to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. The series focuses on the work of Phyllis Schlafly and others. In the book, I highlight the differences between the work that her group, Stop ERA, did in Illinois compared to the pro-ERA efforts in that state, one of the tipping point states in the ERA campaign. Here, I borrow heavily from the work of political scientists Jane Manbridge and Joyce Gelb, whose collective research points to the superior tactics of the Stop ERA movement in that they worked at the grassroots level, building their efforts through pre-existing translocal cells like church groups that leverage the social capital within those cells to create activists. Through the networks of these cells, they created personal relationships with the legislators by being a steady presence at the state capitol in Illinois, and not just shipping individuals in for protest demonstrations once in a while, as now and other groups would do. But it wasn't just the modern women's movement that failed to embrace the translocal model of organizing. Many of the groups that formed in the late 1960s and early 1970s built themselves around a very lawyer and expert-driven model of advocacy, not building out from the grassroots. That style of organizing, if you can call it that, would become a fixture of many groups for the next 40 years. While many of those groups achieved some tremendous victories, at least not until the last decade with the victories by the marriage equality movement, which I'll discuss in a moment, those groups did not achieve the same level of sweeping success as the civil rights movement. Could it be that it was their failure to embrace translocal organizing and inclusive messages that meant that that type of success was out of their grasp? What I try and show in the book, though, is that with the advent of social media and mobile technologies, we are in a new social innovation moment. What is more, I demonstrate the groups that are using the full components of the social change matrix, once again, are starting to have success. In the book, I highlight 4 contemporary efforts that have utilized a blend of tactics, not just harnessing new technologies, but also engaging in a form of translocal organizing and embracing positive, inclusive messages. The 4 movements I explore in depth include the West Virginia teacher strike of 2018, the effort to amend the Violence Against Women Act in 2013, a campaign to raise the minimum wage in Long Beach, California for hotel workers, and the modern marriage equality movement. Each of them deployed the 3 components of the social change matrix I have laid out here, and which I describe in greater detail in the book. Even the marriage equality movement, one that seems to epitomize the lawyer-driven model of advocacy, actually built a movement painstakingly, state by state, until its ultimate victory before the Supreme Court in the landmark ruling Obergefell v. Hodges. That victory, as I recount in the book, was the product of decades of work, including massive street-level organizing. In fact, that movement often restrained the lawyers who wanted to have their Brown v. Board of Education moment until the movement leaders felt the Supreme Court and the United States were ready for marriage equality. One of those leaders was Evan Wolfson, who I interviewed for the book. And for all you law students out there, he started working on marriage equality as a law student in the 1980s. And a paper he wrote while in law school pretty much laid out the equal protection arguments that would win in the Supreme Court 30 years later. So that research and writing you're doing in your upper level writing requirement could actually make a difference in the world someday. Speaking of legal research, an old and wise law librarian once told me that the most important thing about legal research is knowing when to stop. And the same could be said about giving a presentation. I have already taxed your goodwill and patience by going on for too long, so I'll close here. Before I do, let me interrupt this message to place a CLE code: equality. In closing, let me turn back to where I started with this talk, with the middle years of the 19th century. Then Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat, toured the United States, ostensibly to inspect our prisons and jails. His landmark two-part work, Democracy in America, still stands as one of the keenest observations of the origins and DNA of American democracy. For Tocqueville, he was struck by the number of groups that formed in the United States, what he would call associations. As he would write, quote, Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds, constantly unite, unquote. They form groups, quote, religious, moral, grave, futile, very general, and very particular, immense and very small. For Americans, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate, unquote. Comparing practices in the United States to those in Europe, he would say that, quote, everywhere that at the head of a new undertaking, you see the government in France and a great lord in England, count on it that you will perceive an association in the United States. Tocqueville would connect the fact that the United States, whose citizens practice what he would call the art of association, with what he observed as a striking level of economic equality in the United States at the time, at least for white men. Tocqueville would tie the two notions together explicitly, associations and equality. He would note that, quote, the most democratic country on earth is found to be, above all, the one where men in our day have most perfected the art of pursuing the object of their common desires in common and have applied this new science to the most objects, unquote. He would then ask, does this result from an accident, or could it be that there in fact exists a necessary relation between associations and equality? What I try to accomplish in the book is show how these notions are indeed connected, that grassroots translocal networks are critical to social change, particularly in social innovation moments, and even more particularly when those networks strive to bring about greater equality in some form. At a time when we desperately need to work together, when we must realize we are all in this together and must defeat the coronavirus through collective action, even at a distance, I hope the lessons from history can help us grapple with the challenges we now face and those we will inevitably face in the future. My belief is that we are in a social innovation moment, and in such a moment, the groups and movements that have succeeded are those that have leveraged technology to create community across difference. I hope that I've convinced you, even a little, that that is perhaps the future of change. Thank you for putting up with me, for your generosity with your time and your interest in my work. I welcome your questions.